Hello. So as Matt mentioned, I'll be talking about data management as an essential part of marketing automation. So as marketing professionals, we all want to create experiences for people based on their behaviors, based on their preferences, but also based on their purchase activities, and obviously much more. And obviously, doing this, we want our customers to feel that each campaign and each marketing message that we send out is custom made for them. Obviously, and the problem, unfortunately, most of the time is that we rely on poor quality data when doing so. And yet we can agree that we need a strong foundation for our marketing strategy. We also need to have a more proactive approach when we look at the way that we manage our data. And how do we do this, you'll ask? Well, we need to start thinking of how we collect the data, how we organize it, how we clean it up, how we store that data, but also we need to think about protecting the data, so from a security standpoint. And then sharing the data amongst the marketing department, among our colleagues, but also within the company that we work for. So, and when we do that, when we do just that in an effective way and in a proactive way, then we are able to understand better our prospects and our customers, and not only understand them better, but use those insights in order to drive action, in order to drive conversions, to drive retention, and ultimately to drive revenue. So thinking a bit about what's happening in the real world with data management and how companies are using data and how that data is impacting their activity. A recent study from 2021 has revealed that 95% of businesses have seen negative impacts due to poor data quality. So let's dive in a bit deeper into that percentage and understand a bit better how that affects us as marketing professionals, and especially within the marketing department and within the marketing automation team. So if we look at the stats in terms of how that poor quality data impacts our organizations, we find out that over 35% of the respondents have had damages to the reliability of their analytics. So this impacts the way that we do reporting, and not only the way that we do reporting, but also the decisions that then we take based on that reporting. Also, if we look at the other numbers as well, 32% of the respondents have seen negative impacts to their reputation, but also to customer trust. And also 32% have seen negative impacts on the customer experience. So we've talked a bit before about the customer experience and how we can optimize that, but at the same time we're seeing that because the way that we use data and the quality of the data that we currently have and use in our campaigns, that impacts negatively the customer experience, and that can affect the trust that the customers have in us, and not only the trust, but also ultimately our own reputation. So moving on a bit, what does this mean for us? And how do we get started? What should we do next? So how does your data measure up? And when managing your data, it is essential for us to first assess the current state of our data. So when we do that assessment, we need to audit the way that we collect our data. So we need to audit those data collection processes and ensure that we get that data into one integrated platform from where we can use it for all the campaigns, for all the messaging, for segmentation, for personalization. So think about the data that you collect from your customers at every touch point. That can be from a newsletter subscription, that can be from a webinar registration, that can be a demo, a specific event, or surveys, or even all the purchase activities that you get from those customers. So if we're thinking about data and how do we measure it, one important aspect is to think about that data comes in all shapes and sizes, and it's not always easy to define and determine its quality. However, there are a few characteristics that typically typically high quality data has. So those characteristics are regarding the accuracy of the data, the relevancy of the data, how reliable is our data, how complete and how up to date is it. So if we're thinking about accuracy, how accurate is our data, and is that data correct? Does it reflect the real world situation we are looking at? And can we actually use that data to create reporting, to understand the performance of our campaigns, and ultimately take decisions to optimize those campaigns, and not only optimize, but plan for the future? And relevance. The thing is, we collect a lot of data, and unfortunately, we have to be honest with ourselves, and not all the data that we collect will be a game changer. So if there's a reason for why we're collecting a specific piece of information, and the values that we obtain can serve their purpose, then yes, that's data that we should think about collecting, and that has a good quality. But also, if we're talking about the reliability of the data, and I briefly mentioned that we should have all that information preferably into one system, so one source of truth. And when thinking about reliability, does a specific piece of information from one source or system contradict another piece of information from a different source or from a different system? So it's also important to make sure that we have that single point of truth, and we can use that data and we can rely on it. And complete. Is our data comprehensive? Because if not, it might be difficult for us to use it. So when you're thinking about how you are going to collect your data, think about those must-have values that you would need in order to gather good quality data that is actually complete and can be used. So think about the fields, for example, that you want people to add when they are logging in that data. So it can be either, for example, your prospects and your customers, but it can also be internal stakeholders. So that way you can make sure that you don't end up having first names without last names, or incorrect or incomplete phone numbers that then you will not be able to use in order to reach out to your customers or prospects. And last but not least, data is constantly changing. So we need to make sure that we have the latest data available. It's great for us to actually keep track of the historical data and the changes that have happened, but it's also important to make sure that when we are looking at those specific data sets and information, we know that we are looking at the latest information. Because, for example, if we're thinking about the consent that our prospect have given us when they have subscribed to our newsletter, has that consent changed over time? Did they made any updates to their preferences? And if so, we should make sure that all of the systems that we are using are integrated, communicate with each other, and we get access to that information, and we don't send out information, or we don't send out campaigns or emails or anything like that to people that no longer want to hear from us from that point of view. So now that we have a pretty good understanding of the quality of data that we should have and what are those characteristics, let's have a look at some actionable steps that you can take in order to achieve that goal. So if we're thinking about how to effectively manage our data, one thing that I think we all know for sure, no two companies are alike, and that's the same with data management and with how do we plan to manage our data, because each company has its own unique tools, its own unique challenges, and the needs that they need to factor in when they organize their data. So that being said, however, there are a few points that we can apply, a few strategic points that we can apply to that in order to make sure that we have the best approach when dealing with our data management. And part of those strategic points is defining the goals around the data. So depending on the company size, every day we might be collecting anything from like tens or thousands of data points or up to millions or more. So generating large volumes of information. And since there is not a single data management plan that fits all businesses, there are a few options that each business can think about when it comes to understanding their needs. What are they using that data for? And then we should start questioning what do we want to achieve with the data that we are collecting. So do we understand our prospects' needs? Do we want to know who is actively engaged with us? Or again, do we want to improve that engagement? And that is tied to the data that we're collecting and to the goals that we're having set, and that also will influence the way that we develop our processes, the way that we choose our tools in order to do that data management, and also ultimately defining the metrics for success. So when we're looking at the data that we've gathered, can we say that that data is really good for us in order to understand what's happening, what are the customers' needs, what do they want, what would they like to get from us, but also if using that information we can actually drive more revenue in the end, and not only revenue but making sure that we don't damage our reputation in the process. So defining the goals around data is one thing, but at the same time we need to think about creating a sustainable data, processes. So now that you know how you will use the data, it's time to think about the process for collection, for preparing the data, for storing it, and for also sharing it. So if we think about how do we collect data, some of the questions that we can ask ourselves are how and when will we collect that information? But also, what are our data sources? So obviously there are online data sources, there are offline data sources, and we need to make sure that by collecting that information, we have a unified system and an understanding within our company of how do we exactly do that. And as I mentioned before, what are the must-haves when we select and we collect that data. But also, we want to prepare that data after we have collected it, and we would need to think about how do we clean and transform the data that's already been collected? So how do we identify incomplete information that might hinder us from actually going ahead and building our campaigns based on that information? So if we're thinking about incomplete information that has to do with our prospect or customers' job titles or industries or anything like that that we would want then to use for segmentation and for personalization, it's important to also think about those aspects. But also, if we're thinking about data enablement, how do we store the data, how do we integrate it, and how do we make sure that we keep it clean, we keep the data easily accessible for the stakeholders that need to have access to it, but at the same time making it secure. And since most of the people that have joined us are marketing automation specialists, let's not forget that we can also automate a big part of this data processing. And even though studies have found that more than 80% of data practitioners spend most of their time actually trying to find the data and prepare it instead of actually extracting insights from it, by automating parts of that data collection process, parts of the data cleanup process, doing a health assessment of our current data, we can allocate more time towards gathering those insights from it versus just locating the data and trying to make sense of it. So that brings me to systems. And thinking about the questions that we've mentioned previously, what and how should you organize your data, how do you collect it, and so on, it's really important to think about your tech stack for your data ecosystem, and it's never too early to start thinking about data integration. So the sooner you define and develop a plan to integrate and sync the systems that you are using with your marketing automation platform, the better. Because this will help you create alignment within the company. It will help you get access to information from different other departments and stakeholders within the company. But not only that, it will also improve the way that you do that segmentation of the data. So building systems is important, but at the same time, setting some governance standards, it's also really important when we think about the way that we manage our data. And when we say governance standards, think about your standard operating procedures in all things data. So they are a vital part of marketing automation, and they help us to gather and understand the data that we need. But at the same time, they also help with internal alignment. So the whole organization will align through data governance. So that includes technologies, it includes processes, it includes people. So in order for us to make sure that the data is accessible, is shareable, is reliable, and it leads to better business decisions, it's important to have those governance standards set from the get-go. Okay, so now going a bit forward to the fifth step, educate your stakeholders. So this makes me also think about the importance of creating data management documentation. Because if we have that data management documentation, we can use it to align and also to educate stakeholders. So try to explain how the data is collected. Try to explain how we should use that information, and also clarify any specific terms that you might want to make sure that everyone understands. So if we're thinking about how the data is collected and making sure that everyone understands it, think about where your data comes from and how people can actually take action on it. So if we're talking about people, prospects that have given us their consent for example, one-on-one emails, but they haven't given us consent for marketing emails or newsletters, think about what we do with that information and how do we approach that specific prospect. So educating stakeholders is one of the suggestions, the last suggestions in order to build a data management plan. But what's the way forward now with all of this in mind? So I think that it's important for us to be strategic and proactive when it comes to data, instead of being more ad hoc or reactive. Obviously, it's important to be agile and to make changes and to have a system that can support those changes on the go. But at the same time, it's really good for us to stay away from ad hoc changes that will influence the quality of our overall data, and also just reacting to what's happening around us versus actually taking that into consideration when we build our plan. So effective data management includes processes, obviously, for collecting, for organizing, for protecting, storing, and also sharing data. And once we have those processes in place, you can use that data in order to understand your customer insights and then turn them into actions that drive conversions, that drive retention and revenue. So, perfect. Thank you.
Thank you, Ovidio. What about, I mean, I get a feeling sometimes that marketeers are not that interested in data collection and all the data and store that and so on, and maybe depend on and trust on the IT department.
Yeah,
is that so?
Indeed, I think that it's also quite dependent on the size of the company. And we know that in bigger companies at least, IT is responsible for that data, and maybe marketing professionals are less responsible. But at the same time, since we are using that data to drive the results that we have as a marketing team, I think that we need to make sure that we are more involved, we are more aligned with the IT departments into how that data is stored and processed and so on, so we can actually use it in the best way possible.
Well, I mean, sometimes I believe that companies don't really tell the customers and others why they collect data, or showing maybe the value for me as a customer. Like I usually take Runkeeper as an example. If I enter data there, I get immediately a lot of value for it, for myself. But is that so? Is that companies need to be better on giving value for the data they get in?
Yes, I think so, and that also sort of relates to the way that we deal with compliance with specific regulations, because it's important for us, and as I mentioned, to collect the data that it is relevant. So if we're thinking about asking a customer that requested a trial, should we ask for their birthday, for example? If that's not relevant, and that's not an information that we aren't going to use, then maybe we shouldn't actually ask for that birthday, because that might open up a different part when we're talking about regulations and how we deal with that information, and that can pose a threat for us on the long term.
Yeah. And the last question, what about if you start to use AI in the marketing automation processes, will data be even more important?
Yes, definitely, because then I think it's even more important for us to have the clean data there in order to automate everything and to understand the insights that we're getting. Because without clean data, it will be almost impossible to make sense of anything that we will have from that perspective.
Good. Thank you very much.
Thank you as well.